Okay, so working with files. Now that we have our tables and that they are well formatted, we also need to store this data inside files, right? So this chapter includes a suggestion on how to structure your files inside your folder. Well, this is to make the point that an organized folder structure is always better, and that you can recognize an organized folder structure by trying to put yourself into the perspective of someone that access your folder for the first time. So will they be able to navigate the data there or not? If the answer is not, you probably need to guide them through consistent naming and organization of folders. So this consistent naming helps in finding files quickly, and it's also linked to the ability to tell what's the file content without opening it. And especially with biological data, which is often very big data, the ability to tell the file content without opening the file is linked to a significant spare in time, right? So it is important to develop a standardized naming convention for your files. They should be consistent, encode anything that might be very, very relevant to understand the content, like experimental factors and anything that is meaningful for you and your collaborators. Give a sense of the content and easily identify if something is missing. An example of a good naming for a file. So it might include, so it's a name that, first of all, doesn't include spaces, as you might notice. It includes like slashes and then dashes and underscores. And it includes all the meaningful data for this experiment. So the fact that it was normalized data, it's even included somehow as an extension of the file. It's an experiment in long days, or LD. It's from the genotype VA, and it's without media, so off, and at time point 4, and includes the date in a good format. This is just an example. It might work or not for your case, but the thing is, don't be scared of little longer names, especially if they're meaningful. So jumping inside our exercise. So these are the file names that we can find inside the folder. These file names include all relevant information, so they fit whatever we mentioned so far, but they're not consistent. Because, for example, the date is both in a different place of the name and in a different format, or there are different names let me spot other things here. So in general, the order is not the same always. So being so careful about including all your relevant information inside the name, but then not using a consistent format ends up not being very useful at all. So let's discuss a bit what happens. Oops, sorry. What happens in this case? Let's do it together in the interest of time. So these are the explanations of some of the information in this file name, and let's discuss what can be the problem of this. What can be the problem when I'm trying to process these files, for example. For example, what are the problems with having the date first? If the day when you generated the file is also corresponding to the date of the experiment, because this might be the case or not, right? So if that's the case, you can always sort your file by date of creation, and so you will have your file sorted by date. That was the comment. So we don't really need the date at the beginning of the file in this case, right? I agree. Again, we're not proposing a unique magic that works in any case. We are trying to discuss what can work for your case and what not. And I agree about the fact that sometimes it's not needed, but I would also say that you might often be in the case when you generate a bunch of files on the same day, but they do refer to different dates of the actual experiment, right? So in that case, the date of creation will not help you in sorting this data. So it depends on what's the more important information to you, simply. I would say just place at the beginning of the name the information that you more often want to sort based on, right? So any other observation we can make about this? Like, for example, can you tell from this example the importance of the leading zeros? And the leading zeros are those zeros that we include, for example, when we know that a numerical field has a maximum of X digit. In that case, we include the 0 if, for example, July is 07 and not simply 7. What's the point of including that 0? Any guesses? So yes, to keep the file name length the same, but even more importantly, I would say to sort it, because in this way, like for example, let's check these S1 and S12, we ensure then that these are sorted in the correct way if we place a leading 0, right? And this is the case both for file names and for data inside tables when we use numerical data to sort things. Okay. Maybe can you spot the problem when using different cases? So upper and lower, for example, here and here. Do you see any issue with this? Or do you know any issue? When you're sorting, it's often the same if you're sorting with your computer, but different programming languages can interpret these two things as different. So depending on how you process the data, these two things can be interpreted as two different labels. So also in this case, try to be as consistent as possible. So that's the main message of this exercise, actually. Try to be as consistent as possible. So a bunch of do's and don'ts for naming files. Do include date in the name, possibly in the year, month, date format. Include version number if applicable, and use the leading zeros in that. So again, 0 when I know how many digits my version should have. Encode. Did I skip a slide? No. Encode short biological or experimental relevant information to be able to spot to understand the content of the file without opening it. So for example, the sample, the site, patient IDs, or all the IDs that might be relevant, and so on. And also you can include some data operation. For example, after normalizing my data, I can generate another file that includes underscore norm or dot norm. And after cleaning the same and after clustering the same. And this will also be very useful when you're sorting your files, because then you will have the normalized file right after the non-normalized file and so on. Add leading 0 to numerical values, because this will help in sorting the files. Make sure that the format extension is present at the end of the file, and add a README. And this we already mentioned, but this is really, really important. Add a README in the main folder that describes the project structure inside. So the directory and the naming convention and everything else. Avoid using spaces because they often have meaning, and because your programming languages might interpret those spaces. So you don't want to end up in that case. Avoid using special characters and avoid using language-specific characters that might be differently parsed in different conditions. Avoid using very long names, but I would say use names which are long enough to describe your experiment. Avoid repeating information. So if you are already in the electron microscopy folder, you don't really need to indicate again that you are in the electron microscopy folder. Avoid using BPATs with long names, so deeply nested folders with very long names. And now a quick exercise. So based on all of that we just mentioned, what do you think is the best file name in case 1? Again, we're going to do it together. So I would say for the first here, B, if the version is somehow linked to the date and we are not missing any information just by including the version and not the date. Second, A, for the reason that we mentioned, and third, B, for the reason that we mentioned. And okay. So folder and files. And now we're going to have a quick look at the folder organization of your file. So I might have all the files in the main folder of my project, or I might have subfolders specifying the different whatever type of data of my project and having smaller groups of files inside the subfolder. Can you mention some advantages and disadvantages of these two types of data structure? Let's check if the next slide is a comment. Indeed. So the first strategy can work very well if the project has few files, because there's not tons and tons of files inside your directory. And in this way, all of them can be quickly accessed and the different parameters are easily visible, as we all mentioned. Especially if you have a couple of conditions or a couple of genotypes and species, you can easily see not only all the conditions, but also the different options that we have for each specific condition, only if there are few, obviously. The second strategy works better if we have a lot of individual files for each parameters. And yeah, and then this slide includes an example. So imagine the metabolites are measured hourly through the day. This means we have several files for each condition. You would not want to have these number of files inside one folder. You will not be able to even scroll through it. So regardless of whether you're using long file names, documented. So again, going back to the main point, always add a project structure, a README file inside your folder, and use folder to group related file. Name folders appropriately, structure folder hierarchically, and be consistent. And these are all things that we touch upon, so I'm not gonna spend more time on this. And I'm gonna actually skip through this exercise, but quickly mention that these might be different files of organization. Just notice that they all include a citation, a license, and a README file, and this should always be the case. The difference between A, B, and C, D are, for example, that we have a requirements .txt files, both in A and B. Requirements are like dependency. They're usually linked to code projects, and that's why A and B are more typical or recommended for computing projects. C and D are more typical for wet lab or wet biology project. They don't include a README file, but they include both data, the methods, and the results in C. And in D, we have both cumulative files, so files including the process data of all the different conditions, and other subfolders defining specific subcategories inside our data. Maybe quickly mentioning that A and B do instead include things like doc, so the documentation of the code in this case. They include source code folder, or in this case, the code is splitted inside the different subfolders. They include data, in this case also structured in these different subfolders, and results, in this case also structured in this folder. Do you have any comment? Do you see any of your project structure reflected inside this, or is it totally different? Do you have anything else, any other structure to propose? Maybe you could provide a little feedback inside the pad. There is like a row for each of these project structure. You can quickly put an X next to the one that is more similar to what you use. So we can like have a little pool here. I will quickly go through the next couple of slides. So obviously, any fair course should mention backup. You should back up your project and folder, and the backup should be at least in 3 places, and at least one should be offsite, or if you only have 2 places, they should be into different places in the world. USB sticks are failure prone option, because you can lose them, because they can get broken, because any other reason. A robust backup cannot be achieved manually, should be backing up ideally in an automated way every week, month, or whatever works for you, or even day, whatever works for you. If you change the strategy or the file organization inside your project, this should be reflected in your project structure or README document. So you should update the location and names of the files, which follow the old convention. And if you ever happen to be in the case when you need to rename multiple files at once, you can use programs such as Renamer, Renamity, or Rename for Mac. Unless you do have some computational expertise, in that case, you can always write the program to rename the file, right?